In this video, we're going to explore frequency distributions and their graphs. Now first, here are four major characteristics that we pay attention to when we're dealing with data and graphs, and we'll continue to go into these items in more detail later. First is the center, which is a representative value that indicates the middle of our data. Often we look at the median, the mean, and the mode when we're talking about the center. Variability is how much the values vary from one another. Shape is when we start to look at the graph and look at the distribution of that graph. And then outliers are looking at data that goes outside the normal range of the rest of our data points. Now when we talk about a frequency distribution, we're looking at a table that's going to be split into classes, and it's going to then count the frequencies within each of those classes. A frequency just represents the number of entries within one class. Now we have the lower class limit and the upper class limit for each class. And then we also look at the class width. And to find the class width, we can take any two lower class limits or any two upper class limits that are consecutive and subtract one from the other. For instance, 6 minus 1 is 5. But I could have done that here as well. 26 minus 1 is 5 as well. 30 minus 25 is 5. So I know my class width would be 5. Now if I want to construct a frequency distribution, I first need to determine how many classes do I want. Then I need to find my class width by finding my range of the data and then dividing it by the number of classes and rounding up to the next number, even if that range had been come out as a whole number. Then I need to find my class limits. I start with my minimum data entry, and that'll be the first lower limit of my first class. And then I find the rest of my lower limits by adding the class width. Then I need to fill in my upper class limits by subtracting one from my second lower limit, and then I'm going to fill it in by using the class widths as well. And then I count up the frequencies that fall into each class. So let's look at an example. Say I want to make a frequency distribution of 7 classes with this data from 50 customers on how long they're on the internet. First thing, I know I have 7 classes, so my class width, I need my range, which my greatest value was 86, my least was 7, so that's 79. My class width then would be 79 divided by 7, which is approximately 11 and 29 hundredths. I now round that up to 12. So that tells me my class width is 12. Now I can start plugging in my pieces. This minimum value was 7. So 7 plus 12 gives me 19, and then I'm continue to add 12 until I have all 7 lower limits. Now I need to start with my upper limits. I see that I have 19 here, so I'm just going to take 1 off of 19, and that'll give me my first upper limit. And now I'm just going to continue to add 12 to my upper limits. 18 plus 12 is 30, plus 12 is 42, and so on. Now if I go back to my data, I can start to add up how many values fall between 7 and 18 inclusive, how many fall between 19 and 30 inclusive, and so on and so forth. I add them up, and that's what's going to be each frequency. So I'd get 6, 10, 13, 8, 5, 6, 2. If I add up all my frequencies, I'll add up with 50 different data values. And that's what I need to see, is that I had 50 since I had interviewed 50 people. Now there's some other attributes that we talk about with frequency distributions. We talk about the midpoint of a class, the relative frequency of a class, and the cumulative frequency. The midpoint of the class, we just take our two limits and divide by 2, and it tells us where's the midpoint of each of those classes. The relative frequency just tells us the percentage of the data that falls in a particular class. So what we do is we take that class's frequency and divide by the total number that we have for our sample. And last one, the cumulative frequency, what we do is we start with the very first frequency we have in the first class, and then we're going to continue to add them up as we go down in each of our classes. So let's look at an example with our data that we had before. If I wanted to do the class midpoint, remember it's just the lower plus the upper divided by 2, so it'd be like 7 plus 18 divided by 2, and give me 12 and a half. And I'm going to do that for each class. For relative frequency, as you remember, it was the class frequency divided by the sample size. In this case, the sample size was 50. So I'd have 6 divided by 50, 10 divided by 50, 13 divided by 15, so on. And there'd be all my relative frequencies. And then the cumulative frequency, I'm going to add to the prior f. So I start with 6, and then 6 plus 10 is 16. 16 plus 13 is 29, so on and so forth, so that I know that my final value of my cumulative frequency should be the same as my sample size. Now, last thing we're going to look at is graphing the frequency distributions. So we can either graph a frequency histogram or a relative frequency histogram, depending on what we want to do. They will look the same. The difference is going to be our vertical axis. Our horizontal axis is always going to be our quantitative measures of data for the data, and then our vertical or y-axis is going to be the frequencies, depending on whether I use frequency or relative frequency. So let's look at what we've done before. We already have data here for lower class limit, the upper class, midpoint frequency, and relative frequency. And let's look how we could do this in Excel. So here's all my data already entered, and I have my frequency distribution as well as my relative frequencies here. If I want to create a frequency distribution in Excel, I'm going to highlight my frequency values. I'm going to go to Insert, Column, and then the first 2D column. Now, if you read before, it said that all the values should touch, all the bars. So to do that, I'm going to go to my chart layouts and drop down and do number 8. Layout 8 gives me all the bars touching, and it tells me to fill in my axes. So my chart title, and then number of minutes. And since I said this was frequency, oops. Now, if you look down here, these values are not correct. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. They don't match with what these bars are representing. The bars are representing each of our classes. So to change that, what I do is I'm going to click on my x-axis. I'm going to right click, select my data. Now it's my horizontal labels I need to change. So I push Edit, and what I want to use in this case is my class midpoints. This is just the standard method for doing so. I click OK, and now I have a frequency histogram. Now if you want the lines to be in there to separate, I can right click on the bars, and I can go Data Labels. You can see it puts the numbers there. And if I want the lines, I can come up here. I can do it this way. I can just change it to one of these other colors, and the lines will appear. I can do the same thing with the relative frequency. Let me pull this one to the side. So in this case, I'm going to highlight my relative frequency information. Go Insert, Column, 2D column. Pull it off the other one. And just like before, my chart layout was 8. I'm going to change this to internet usage. My vertical is now the relative frequency. And it's still number of minutes. Now if you look, I'm going to right click. I'm going to select my data for my x-axis again by changing this horizontal again with my class midpoints. Click OK, click OK. And again, if I want to make it, I can choose any of these values so that I can see the lines between. And if I want the values above, I right click on the blue and then add data labels. If you look at the two graphs, they're exactly the same. The difference is this is frequencies and this is relative frequencies.